Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eric Olson, and I'm the Associate Director at the Mexico Institute. And I want to give you a special welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center on this July 9th. I see that some of the 4th of July vacationers are slow to arrive this morning, so I'm sure we'll be joined by a number of other people. But we did want to get started. We want to welcome folks who are viewing this online through the Wilson Center web feed, and also folks from C-SPAN who have joined us this morning. Give them a special welcome. As all of you know, Mexico held a historic election on July the 1st, and historic in many ways that we will discuss this morning. But one of us was that it appears to have resulted in the election of Enrique Peña Nieto as the president of Mexico. His election has now been confirmed by the Federal Electoral Institute. And while there still remains some controversy out there about the results and how those are going to be interpreted, we feel like this has been a very positive, good exercise in democracy and elections in Mexico. And we've assembled this morning an excellent panel to help us discuss the results, probably more important, what they mean, what they tell us about the thinking that pervades in amongst the Mexican electorate, and what they may mean, what this may mean, in fact, for the future of Mexico and, to some extent, U.S.-Mexican elections. Our first panelist has been delayed, as I said. He will come at some point, and we'll probably end up with him rather than begin with him. So I wanted to turn now to our colleagues and friends who have joined us this morning. I will briefly introduce them, then they will come and speak briefly, and we'll have some time for questions at the end of that. We're going to begin with Jorge Buendia. He's the executive director or CEO of Buendia and Laredo, which is one of the top public opinion and consulting firms in Mexico, well known for their polling and public opinion in Mexico. He was the lead pollster for the Universal newspaper, and also did some really interesting polling for the Dallas Morning News about public attitudes towards the issue of public security, the role of the Mexican military, and a number of things. We've asked him to dive into the question of polling and public opinion and what these elections tell us. Polling, as you may know, in Mexico has been itself a subject of great debate. Questions about the reliability of it, the neutrality of it, and so what better opportunity than to hear from one of Mexico's leading pollsters and public opinion surveyors. So thank you, Jorge, for being with us.
Thank you.
Then we'll also hear from Joy Langston, professor at CIDE, and you'll hear CIDE come up numerous times, one of the leading public universities in Mexico City, the Center for Research and Economic Teaching in Mexico, and Wilson Center and the Mexico Institute in particular has had a very close relationship with CIDE. Joy is an expert on Mexican politics and democracy and has been working lately, most recently, on the issue of the PRI, the Party of the Institutional Revolution that has now regained the presidency after a 12-year hiatus. So very appropriate research, very timely research for us to hear from Joy on the meaning of this election. Then we'll hear from a very good friend and colleague, Francisco Gonzalez, associate professor at the Paul Nietzsche School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, a Mexican who divides his time between Washington, D.C. and Mexico. We appeared together just last week on the Diane Rehm Show, and you will see that he's a very dynamic and insightful speaker. He spent a week or 10 days in Mexico around the time of the election, so has a lot to tell us firsthand and from his own academic research. And then last but not least, we have invited our new Wilson Center visiting scholar, Mauricio Merino, who has been a longtime friend of the Mexico Institute, also a professor at CIDE in Mexico City, but on a year-long sabbatical, spending some of his time here in Washington, D.C., working on a book on accountability, which has been one of his main themes for academic research and professional work over the years. He's been traveling to many parts of the world to look at how governments and countries deal with the issue of accountability in government. So we're very welcome to have him, excited to have him here. Welcome. I should point out also that Mauricio was a member, a citizen councilor in the 2000 election, a member of the Federal Electoral Institute, or IFE. That was, a historic moment for Mexico when they held their first presidential election under the guidelines of an independent Federal Electoral Institute for the first time. Mauricio was a part of that historic group of people that oversaw that election and saw the PRI, the long-ruling governing party, lose the election for the first time, and now 12 years later, they're winning again. And so we're delighted to have Mauricio with us as well. So with that introduction, I'm going to invite Jorge, who has a presentation, to come forward. From beginning, no? There you go.
Well, thanks, Eric, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to attend this incredible conference. Well, I'm going to start speaking of what has been a major, probably a scandal would be a good word to describe it, about what went wrong with the polls. In general, public opinion polls overestimated the PRI and underestimated López Obrador. And this is something that affected the majority, most of the polls. And I will try to give you an explanation of what really happened. I mean, we are at the earliest stages of research, but I think that at least I have found a hypothesis that it's the more plausible, that there is evidence to support it of what went wrong. The first thing is that you can look at these graphs, probably will not look that well, but these are all the polls that were published during the campaign. These polls adjusted by the actual result. You can see that the overestimation of all the polls, they gave the PRI an advantage or a share of the vote about 4, 5, 6 percentage points higher than it got on election day, and also an underestimation of López Obrador. But let me first point out that, as you can see, in all surveys, Peña Nieto was in first place. There was not even a single published poll that had other outcome than this, except the López Obrador poll that had him 2 percentage points ahead of Peña Nieto, but no one knew who did that research. Secondly, as you can see, all the polls show how López Obrador got into second place. He started in third place, but consistently he began to improve, and by May, it was very clear that he was in second place, so the polls reflected this pretty well. Third, if you look at now there's been talk, especially by the left, that there was a conspiracy of the polls, especially by the media and pollsters. But if you look at 2 weeks before the election, there was not even a single public opinion poll that was consistently different from the others. Even Reforma had a 12 percentage points advantage for López Obrador. The pollster or the traditional pollster for López Obrador, Covarrubias and Associates, they were not publishing the results because obviously the López Obrador campaign didn't like it. But the results were also an advantage of Peña Nieto by 10, 11 percentage points. So 2 weeks before the election, all major polls have more or less a good advantage for Peña Nieto. So there was a divergence at the end on the final measurement. And so the question is, what happened, what went wrong? And I think that just to put into context and to give you an idea of what I think is the most plausible explanation, this has to do with the new electoral law and why this impacted the measurement of public opinion in Mexico. Basically, for the first time since 1988, all parties had to appear separately in the ballot, even though they were nominating the same candidate. This meant that there were only 4 presidential candidates, but there were 7 partisan choices in the ballot. In 2006, the law allowed that all parties nominating the same candidate could appear under a single banner, a single logo. So actually, the ballot in 2006, what they reflected was the strength of the candidates, why this was not so in 2012. And why I think this is important, because look at the actual official results. It is a nightmare. Well, this is more or less what you expect, but look at the combinations. There was 8 percentage points of the electorate that crossed both the PRI and the Green Party logos in the ballot. 6.1% that crossed all 3 parties that nominated López Obrador, and so on. There were about 16 percentage points, 16 out of 100 voters that voted for different combinations of parties. I don't think that any pre-electoral poll was able to measure this accurately. And this, no pre-electoral poll that I know of was able or was telling us that this would happen. I mean, this actually reflects a very complex voting pattern. We hadn't seen it before. In 2009, the electoral law applied to the same electoral law applied, but it's a midterm election, so it's a partisan vote, and we didn't see this multiple voting. But this was really, really important, and obviously in measurement terms, this affected very much. What does this mean in terms of measurement? That probably what was more important in this election was to measure candidate strength, and not to use in a very orthodox way a simulated ballot that has the same structure that the official ballot, because we would not be able to capture this, because this is obviously due to the fact that the same different parties nominated the same candidate. For instance, you could, if you follow the Mexican campaign, you could see Peña Nieto's TV ads asking for the vote for the Green Party. And you could see also the Workers' Party, the PT, asking the vote for López Obrador, the same thing for the PRD and Movimiento Ciudadano. So it was very, very clear that the same candidate was asking the vote for different parties. And this obviously found a reflection on the ballot on election day. But this tells you about a very complex voting pattern that I think that it only could have taken place on election day. In what sense? This requires a lot of attention to the ballot, which parties nominate the same candidate, and all that stuff. And to give you an idea of the measurement issues, if you compare the official results with exit polls, which were highly accurate on election day, and I want to stress this, these are the actual results of our exit poll and the official results. If you look at candidate, I mean, the difference between each candidate is less than 1 percentage point, well within the sampling error. But if you look at the exit poll results disaggregated by party, I only have 8% report for the multiple parties vote. I underestimated the multiple parties vote. This is, and I want to stress this was a measurement taken a few seconds or minutes after the people casted their vote. It was the same, the identical ballot, color one, and it didn't measure accurately all the multiple vote. But we were able to measure accurately candidate strength. So to summarize what happened, I think that what did happen is that those polls that were able to better measure López Obrador and Peña Nieto were those who were asking about candidates and not those who use, like I did, the more orthodox approach, which was to use an identical simulated ballot. If you were a pollster, you would probably have done better if you were going to ask only for 4 the candidates. Among all these 4 candidates, whom would you vote for? And not handing in a simulated ballot. I think that many of the firms that deviated from the official result were using the simulated ballot. So, but this is a measurement problem, and I think that what we have to do in the industry in Mexico is to get rid of the simulated ballot, because it's not actually measuring in a good way what is going on in terms of the strength of the candidates. And indeed, in the US, this is what is done, because you use telephone polls. You don't try to actually reflect the ballot as it takes place, or the same identical ballot, because here it is used machines, electronic voting, and all other kind of stuffs. So probably we will have to change that, especially in elections for president or for big gubernatorial elections, especially in a candidate center age. Okay, this being said, I will show you some of the reasons behind the vote of Mexico and the patterns of voting. This is based on the exit poll that I just mentioned. First thing regarding turnout. This is a comparison of the composition of the exit poll and the lista nominal, or the electoral register. As you can see, there are no big biases, or there is no bias in the turnout rates or the expected participation of the different socioeconomic groups. So what we have here is that, and this is really surprising, because usually the younger people, they go to the polls in a lower proportion than the rest of the population, but here we find more or less the same proportion. So what this tells us is that unlike other elections, and this is a hypothesis that we'll have to wait for the official results that will be delivered by IFE, but unlike other elections, younger voters did not abstain as they had done in the past. They more or less voted at the same rate than the other groups. This is a profile of support for each of the major candidates, and there are very important patterns. First, even among female voters, López Obrador did a little bit better or as well as Josefina Vázquez Mota. But still the lead was 9 percentage points for Enrique Peña Nieto. Male voters were the ones who were not, who were more pro López Obrador than female voters, and this is a pattern that we have registered for many, many years. Male voters are more pro-left in Mexico than female voters. Female voters probably are more conservative, and they tend not to vote that much for the left as male voters. But look also at young people. It's almost a tie. And this is a very important result, because people between the ages of 18 and 29 they represent more or less 1/3 of the electorate, 30% of the electorate. So the fact that López Obrador did quite well within this group, and also the fact that this segment voted at a very good rate, it is very, very important to explain why the race was closer than expected. Look at the other age groups. The advantage of Peña Nieto is higher, 9 percentage points among the 30 to 44 years old cohort, and 9 percentage points among the 45 to 59 cohort. In terms of education, what you can see is that Peña Nieto did much better among people with primary and secondary education, while he lost among those with high school or college education. This is also a very important pattern. Another thing is that this group, college people and younger people, tend to be the more volatile. They tend to be more independent, and what this suggests is that the independent vote went for the López Obrador candidacy. But to summarize these results, at the beginning, when I was writing the title of this presentation, I was thinking about something like new wine in all bottles, the Mexican voter in 2012. This is the same pattern that the PRI had when it was in power 30 years ago. The lower educated people, the poorer people supported more the PRI than the more urban and the more educated people. And we have gone back to this very old pattern of voting, where the more modern Mexicans support the opposition to the PRI, while the people who are less well-to-do, less educated, tend to support the PRI. This is a very old pattern that it's coming back with a vengeance. Okay. I will show you some other graphs. This is partisan choice by presidential approval. And as you can see, those who disapprove the performance of President Calderón, 18% of voters, tended to vote more for López Obrador than Peña Nieto. And those who approve, obviously, were more likely to vote for the PAN. But what is really important is that you can see that López Obrador was able to capture all the protest votes. He was identified more as an opposition candidate than Peña Nieto. And this also explains one of the very important dynamics of this campaign, how an opposition candidate became a candidate of the establishment. The Mexican voters didn't perceive Peña Nieto as an opposition candidate. Rather, in some cases, it seemed that he was the incumbent. If you were going to look at the TV ads, sometimes there were a lot of criticism about Peña Nieto's record while in the state of Mexico. Everybody was talking about Peña Nieto's record, and no one was talking about Felipe Calderón's record as president of Mexico. It was one of the very strange things of this election that Enrique Peña Nieto became the candidate of the establishment, sometimes looking like the incumbent, and this really didn't work well for him because López Obrador was able to gain the support of the people who were more unsatisfied with presidential performance. And also, if you look at the people who thought that the country was going for in the wrong track, also, as things as evaluation of how Mexico is going get worsened, support for López Obrador increases. It's a very clear line. But Peña doesn't benefit that much of that insatisfaction with the status quo. So the bet of Peña Nieto of presenting himself as a more institutional candidate at the end didn't work out that well for him, although he won by almost 7 percentage points. We don't see, in terms of priorities, either economic growth, of tackling insecurity, that there is an advantage for any of the candidates. More or less, the percentages don't change depending on the priority. The people, we don't see any evidence either of some strategic voting. In general, the percentage of votes for each of the candidates, depending on the reason that it was a sincere vote or it was a vote to avoid another candidate to win, there are no major difference. And I'm going to close with this data on use of social networks. Probably the most important thing that happened in this election was the involvement of young people and Facebook and Twitter. And as you can see, Peña Nieto lost among the users of social media, among Facebook users, among Twitter users, and in general, among the people that use more heavily this kind of instruments, the young people and the college-educated people. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to try to get Joy's presentation up here. Give me a second. Okay.
Is there a, there's a, who's he, what
To the right.
Excellent, thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I am currently finishing a book that explains how the PRI has been able to change, adapt to the new realities of electoral competition. And so all of a sudden, in 2000, when the PRI lost Los Pinos, or the presidential mansion, people started joking with me that I was no longer a political scientist and that I was going to have to be a historian. And I said, just wait, just wait. 12 years later, as it turns out, I can again be a political scientist. Now, Eric asked me to sort of present to you all something that explained why the PRI won these elections. And I think there are two basic causes here. There are structural factors and there are conjunctural factors. Now, Jorge just spoke to us very strongly and very clearly about some of the conjunctural factors, so I'm going to concentrate more on sort of the structure of power that the PRI had from 2000 to 2012 that helps explain why it was able to come back, really come back with a bang. So why did the PRI win? First of all, it's strong in all regions. This is not a regional party like the PAN and the PRD. The PAN is the center-right National Action Party, and the PRD is the center-left Party of the Democratic Revolution. Those two, as we're going to see with some numbers, are regional parties. They have regional bases of power, electoral power. The PRI, on the other hand, is a national party. It has electoral party, power in all regions of the nation. Second, there were no major intra-party splits or divisions. They did not fracture over the selection of the candidate, as they almost did in 2006. Third, and this is much more of a conjunctural factor, they had a very strong candidate. You know, you can complain and you can make fun of Peña Nieto, but he was an extraordinarily strong candidate. And it wasn't just because he was handsome. There are other reasons that explain. The two people I have up here, by the way, this is Manlio Fabio Beltrones. He will probably be the next pre-leader in the lower house. He's an extremely powerful politician, yet he is not closely linked to Peña Nieto. So we're going to talk about that a little bit at the very end. And this is La Elba. This is the head of, and I had a very good picture of her. I did not make fun of her. Elba Ester Gordillo is the head of the extremely powerful and very large National Teachers Union, the National Teachers Union. She was somewhat connected to the PRI. She's certainly not an enemy of Peña. So most people expect her party, the Panal party, to be able to be fairly easily convinced to support PRI bills in Congress. So let's talk about why the PRI is so strong. First of all, as I'll show you, there are tremendous power of the PRI governors. Governors, the PRI governors, are the basis, one of the most important bases of the party today, and have been since the loss in 2000. And as I will argue, even before 2000, the governors were the base of the party. Why are governors so powerful? Governors win elections. Second, PRI avoided fragmentation. This is extremely important because in the 2006 presidential election, the northern governors basically said no to Roberto Madrazo, who's the PRI's 2006 presidential candidate. And in saying no, they helped him lose by such a large margin. That did not happen in 2012. And finally, and I think this is really important, this is something that nobody's really spoken about, is within the PRI, there are always going to be extremely ambitious people who want the president's candidacy. So one way that you can avoid splits is to have one candidate who's so popular and everyone has this idea that he's going to win, that it does not make sense for other ambitious PRI leaders to split. And this is, again, the case of Manlio Fabio, who is basically the other contender for the internal nomination to the presidency. He was so far behind that he knew he could never, A, beat Peña in the internal nomination process, or B, perhaps not even win the presidency. So therefore, it made no sense for him to split off. He stays within the party, he's loyal, and now he's about to be rewarded with another excellent job, which is being head of the PRI in the Congress. Now, here's the PRI governorships, and the PRI's in the dark red. And this is right before the elections. In the worst moments of the party, and this is roughly between 2000 and 2003, the PRI still held 17 to 18 of the 32 governorships. Here in 2011, they held roughly 20 to 21. And most of the reasons why the PRI, and if you see here, here's Sinaloa. Here, a very important state because the PRI lost it for the first time. Why did the PRI lose it? A split from the PRI. Here in Tabasco, it's still red in this. It just lost it in 2012 elections. Why did the PRI lose it? A split within the PRI. Mostly, one can say that except for certain states within the sort of traditional PAN stronghold, which is called the Bajío, the PRI loses elections because of internal splits within the state-level PRI. So unless you have a split, the PRI is probably going to continue to govern. And if it manages to overcome these internal divisions, then many times it can retake the governorship, which was certainly the case in many states, including Chiapas, Chihuahua many years ago, et cetera. So what you have here are really powerful national support for the party. Why do you care about why do you care about having governors? Why should the PAN and the PRD be so worried about not having more governors? Governors help you win elections, both local elections and federal elections. Governors can use a wide sort of range of instruments, both legal and illegal, or somewhat legal, or slightly less than legal, to help their co-partisans, other pre-candidates, either at the state or federal level, win elections. This is extremely important when you're talking about federal deputy elections. Why? Because the money you get as a party depends on how many seats you win in the lower house. This is really important. Not only that, that will help determine the kind of power you have in the legislature. So even if you don't have the executive, you don't control the executive branch, if you, like the PRI almost always did, have a strong centrist caucus in the lower house, what does that mean? That means you can always make the executive negotiate with you. That's how they stayed sort of politically important during the years out of power from 2000 to 2012. And this is going to make the PRI obviously a central part of the legislative branch in the 2012 to 2018 period. Why? Because governors not only help you win the presidency, they help you win both Senate seats and federal deputy seats. All right. Now, these numbers, this means circumscription. This is basically a regional district. Because remember, Mexico has a mixed system. So you have 300 single-member districts as well as 200 proportional representation seats. These seats are won through 5 regional districts. And this is a really nice way of looking at, oops, sorry, it's still in Spanish. It says regional weaknesses. These are single-member districts by region. So these are the single-member districts won by the PAN, the PRD, and the Green Party. So in the first circumscription, this is the Northwest. So this is Sonora, Sinaloa, Baja California. The PAN managed to win only 13 seats. This is a traditional stronghold. These are the 2012 elections. The PRD won 0 seats in this area. In the entire region of the Northwest, the PRD did not win a single member district, not one. This speaks to a terrible weakness in the North. And then look at the PRI. This is usually out of 60. It can be either 59 or 61, but just take it from 60. The PRI won 47 of the 60 single-member districts in that region. And here we go. This is circumscription 2 is the Northeast. The PAN did far better here. This is Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, states in the far northeast where, by the way, the Zetas have been extremely powerful. I mean, this is something really interesting that one saw in this vote count for the presidential election. The PAN's candidate did extremely well in the Northeast. However, the PRI still did extremely well in this region. And again, look at the PRD, not a single member district won. And now here we go to the Southeast. The PAN drops tremendously and wins only 6 of the 60. That's 10% of all those single member districts. The PRD does far better, and the PRI continues to do very well. And then here again, now you see the weaknesses of the PAN. In the Guerrero, DF, and Morelos states, the PAN only wins 5. The PRD wins 41. Why? This is the federal district. This is Mexico City. The PRD does extraordinarily well and has done historically in the 27 districts now in Mexico City. And here you see the PRI doesn't do very well, but the PRI's weakest showing is as strong as this PAN's second highest showing. And then this is the state of Mexico, Michoacan. The PRI, again, comes roaring back. So the PRI is a national party. The PAN, the center-right National Action Party, and the center-left PRD are not national parties. It is no surprise then that the PRI, with a good candidate, would be able to come back to power. Okay. Here are the electoral results for state and municipal elections. And what you see here, they start in 1980. Look at the PRI. They used to win, this is in terms of percentage of votes, used to win almost 90%. This is what is called a hegemonic party. This is not a dominant party like in India or Japan. This is a hegemonic party. And then it drops really dramatically, but only until 1995. And then the support at the municipal and governor level levels off at around 42%. It does not drop after 2000. It does not go down. It stays steady. Why? The PRI is an extremely popular party, both at the municipal and at the state level. All right, party ID very quickly because I'm running out of time. Here is the PRI. And you would think in late 1980s that it would still be a popular party. It is. This is how many percentage of the voting population that identifies with the party. It's over 30%. It spikes, and then it goes down, and it's still 30%. Look at the PAN, and this is going to be sort of the tragedy for the PAN. Here's the 2000 PAN number. It's going up. Oh, look, it catches the PRI, and then it starts going down again. And what we're going to see in the next slide is look at this. Even after the PRI's debacle in the 2006 elections, when Roberto Madrazo came in 3rd place, the PRI still had a higher percentage of the voting population that just identified with it. People liked the PRI. And then here you see it. This is during Calderon's presidency. And as we saw from Jorge's number, Calderon was not a reviled president. People liked him. Even during this presidency, the PAN did not manage to communicate with voters, and the PRI did. And that, I think, let me just go back here. So just to sort of end up this talk, is that the PRI has enormous power because voters at the municipal and state levels always liked the PRI. They never gave up on the PRI. They never switched to identifying with either the PAN or the PRD. They have very good governors. The governors, once they get in office, tend to stay in office, or the party does, because remember, there's no consecutive re-election in Mexico at any level of government. This is the party that knows how to govern, and thanks to these governors, it is able to win elections at the federal level. Now, what happens is, what was so good for the PRI in this case was it had an extremely good candidate, it ran a very good campaign, and there were no splits among the different PRI forces thanks to the just enormous popularity of Peña Nieto. And just to end, I'm going to tell you a little story. In 2007, I went to one of these big PRI lunches that they have, and it was a PRI lunch that was hosted by the state of Mexico. And it was sort of brought in the governor. He was still governor of the state of Mexico this time. And even then, it was obvious to everyone he was going to be the PRI's candidate, and he was going to win. They literally carried him aloft like a Roman emperor, sort of through the streets. Even then, so what that tells you was the PRI had been planning this for years. They knew it had the right candidate, and he was able to maintain splits to a minimum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Francisco? You don't have.
Thanks very much. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you to Andrew Seeley, to Eric Olson for the kind invitation. It's good to see everyone here this morning. I want to share with you a few reflections regarding the elections last week. And I've divided them into three issues. First, some surprises, then realities, what the new political configuration in Mexico will look like and what the dynamics might look like, and then some of the challenges. So regarding surprises, I think, post factum, it's very easy to say, things were meant to be all right, things were meant to be peaceful. In fact, up until a few days before, there was, significant uncertainty throughout society regarding the potential for violence during the elections. Many of you have seen not only increasing amounts and intensity of violence, we see it also not just targeted among drug traffickers and state officials among themselves. You also see it in public places, plazas, schools, and this is where many of the ballot boxes, polling stations were located. So that was a positive surprise. At first, around, what was it, maybe 8:30, 9 p.m. of that Sunday the 1st, after the president of the Federal Electoral Institute declared after a short, statistically significant simulation that Peña Nieto was ahead by around 6.57 percentage points, I think many people breathed a sigh of relief. We're not back to 2006 when, less than 250,000 votes, 0.5% of the total voting separated Andrés Manuel López Obrador, PRD, the left, from today's president, Felipe Calderón, PAN, on the right. So that was good. I think the, again, uncertainty and how could we call it? A wave of scrutiny, which in fact had been taking place at least since January, February, and were both, particularly the PRD, but also the PAN, had been crying wolf time and time again. The PRI is using more resources than it reports. The PRI has a strategic alliance. In fact, not the PRI. Governor Peña Nieto, since before he became governor of Estado de Mexico, had a strategic alliance with the largest media conglomerate in the country, Televisa. It's been exposed with original documents. So you've got the PRI steamroller. No surprises there. That's the way they operate. They're a very pragmatic party, as Joy reminded us. If they see a strong person they can, rally around, they will act like a very effective pack, pragmatic pack of political animals, much more so than the PAN and the PRD. I think that many of us made the mistake after the president of the Electoral Institute came out and said, don't worry, it's not as close as last time. Immediately you get national television, President of the Republic, congratulating Enrique Peña Nieto. And minutes later you get Peña Nieto himself making what, in all appearances was basically an acceptance speech. All of this happened before there was a president-elect in Mexico. The IFE finally pronounced itself, as Eric reminded us at the very beginning, on just yesterday, a week after the election. And the congratulations start pouring in. Colombia, Chile, President Obama, everyone congratulates Peña. I understand probably that there was a strong conscience about the potential for conflict given what had happened in 2006. I think these shows of enthusiasm were premature, and most of us were caught in them. I myself was writing a little blog for my students at SAIS, at Johns Hopkins, just real time, telling them what I saw. And I said, yeah, July the 1st, this is an election that yielded credibility and wide legitimacy. 3 days later, I was biting my tongue. Big mouth strikes again. I'd spoken too soon. Because I think even the PRI now admits this was not an equal election. The evidence of systemic vote buying is out there. It continues to rage in Mexico. 2 or 3 main vehicles have been uncovered. Banco Monex, one of the largest retail supermarkets, Soriana. In some states where observers were asked not to go given conditions on the ground with the war on drugs, places like Veracruz, like Tamaulipas, parts of Guerrero, there were no observers, so we don't know what happened there. There might have been coercion. We don't know. I retracted my that saying, great credibility and legitimacy, and retorted to what has become now the conventional wisdom, which is the elections were legal because it is impossible once you start opening ballot boxes to distinguish bought from non-bought votes. Sincere from non-sincere, you just can't do it. The point is it's out there, and legitimacy is an issue which, like the pulse, varies. It's a matter of public opinion. Today, probably 1.5 in every 3 or 4 Mexicans think these elections were not equal, think, as Joy told us, as Jorge beforehand told us, this was from the very beginning the candidate of the establishment. And I liked a lot that perspective, Jorge's perspective about Peña Nieto in fact acting and being seen and perceived and scrutinized as an incumbent. Someone, was going to be more a referendum on him, when in fact, in theory, he should have been the opposition. So that was the other surprise. Legal, but not legitimate. What does this mean? It probably means that the PRI will have to cede some more in terms of negotiations. It means that because they do not control a simple majority either in the lower or the upper chamber, some of the usual suspects, Maestra El Baester's 11 deputies will become pivotal to pass many reforms, and therefore this is someone who remains at the core of today's power bloc alongside the Partido Verde. My sense is that a bit like in the aftermath of the very questioned 1988 elections, probably we could say those were neither legal nor legitimate, because there was never a vote count. Remember, the votes went up in flames, mysteriously in the basement of the Chamber of Deputies. That's a long story, that's 88. But the key point is that the PRI and the PAN struck a deal which allowed this modernizing agenda to start taking effect under Salinas. You could very well see PRI and parts of PAN traditionally a very cohesive party with strong ethos, is now suffering internal factionalism. People are running to the boats to save themselves, and so the PRI will be able to play with PAN, some of PAN. It will certainly be able to play with a PANAL, El Baster's party, and with the Verdes. And so from that perspective, you've got an executive which, at least for the next 3 years, will be probably the strongest in the last 3 presidencies. Another surprise, very quickly, I'm not going to go into it because Jorge already gave his presentation, but certainly my sense is that the polling industry suffered an existential crisis. The industry became politicized. The industry, of course, depends on credibility, depends on people believing what they say. I think a majority of Mexicans think that a majority of pollsters, tried to shape rather than to reflect reality, and that this was done in a consistent manner in favor of the candidate of the establishment. Realities. In as much as the PRI won, is this a return to the past? All the newspapers in here, in Spain, in the UK, in Mexico itself have been raising this question. There is no return to the past. There was no carro completo, an entire power block behind you. The opposition remains alive and kicking, as I said, without some PAN support, both in the upper and the lower chambers. Peña Nieto's reforms won't be able to be as ambitious as he might want them to be, particularly labor, energy, fiscal reform, and something regarding social security. So no return to the past. The PRI will have to keep wheeling and dealing, but this time from a position of power. Keep an eye on the questioned legitimacy. Keep an eye on the social networks where Jorge showed a clear advantage. Those who are members of the generation of social media, and given the ripple effects that social media has on the ground, on real time, we will keep watching that, because this is a new factor in civil society. I'm not saying that they're going to save democracy from the hands of the cynics, but certainly I think there is a point that can be made. Do they become absorbed into the political system and end up like many social movements in the US, in Europe, finally coming into one of the main tents, or do they remain out there trying to advance accountability, not only of the government, but also of the opposition? Another issue regarding reality. The left, I think, strengthened its core power in the capital city. That was a 40+ percentage point victory by the PRD. Joy showed us those very important numbers as well. By far their largest voting in Distrito Federal, Mexico City, with around 7 million voters, Morelos, Guerrero, and others. Now, the problem for the left is that this is a great anomaly. They control the neuralgic center of the country and some parts of the south, but little else. And my prognosis, I wish there was a modern left in Mexico. Mexico, from my perspective, badly needs a progressive agenda, an agenda that prioritizes social justice. Mexico is now one of the 4 most unequal countries in Latin America, just neck on neck with countries like Brazil, Colombia, and some of the Central American countries. Mexico badly needs social justice. But the left, my prognosis is bad. I don't think the left can do too much. It remains too fractious. Many of them came from the PRI, and so they have the same habits. It's vertical control, nationalism. Redistribution is rhetoric, but in reality, it's pragmatic, and more often than not, much more often than not, self-serving. Challenges. The candidates were trying to outbid one another as López Obrador started climbing in the polls. PAN and PRI had, gone for a relatively conservative agenda regarding economic issues. As AMLO started soaring in the polls May, June, they had to adopt that, and therefore they adopted the language of subsidies to electricity and gasoline, and cheaper credit. So there are lots of promises out there. This is going to be a process of how to manage the process of frustrated expectations. And with 90% plus of the federal budget already earmarked, there's little room for maneuvering. So lots of promises. How are you going to deal with that? That's one for Peña Nieto. Two more things, 2 minutes, and I finish. A second challenge is, the PRI has been saying, we will continue the fight against organized crime at the same time that we bring down violence. Wow. How do you square that circle? That's a big one. That I think could make or break the legacy of this president. They've come out with something which appears to be trying to bridge things, saying, well, we're going to base our new measure for measuring success. We're going to change metrics. It's not going to be number of kingpins that we catch and extradite to the US. It's not going to be the amount of narcotics that are interdicted. It's going to be the number of citizens per 100,000 that get killed. Okay, you can read many things into that. I like it. I like that because I have family, friends, acquaintances in Mexico who've been terrified the last 5 years, who live terrified. Middle-class people, professional people going on about their lives, terrified. And the last one, of course, is the need to inject dynamism into the economy. You all know the story about the monopolies. This is a rentier economy. And of course, the great difficulty here is that the coalition that has enabled this concentrated economy to continue to thrive has been basically crafted by businessmen and PRI and PAN politicians when either of those were incumbents. My sense is that it's key for this person to, really do something the first 100 days of his term, lay down the roots of what will be either strong or weak leadership and authority. As we said, the PRI is a pragmatic party. If his colleagues see him as an effective person who the people like and who's gaining resources and gaining in popularity, they'll fall behind him. The PRI is far from ideological. It's very pragmatic. His first 100 days, I think, will really allow us to see if there's really a break with any of these three important challenges that I pointed out. Thank you so much.
And then we're going to take advantage of Dr. Mauricio Merino being here at the Wilson Center for 2 months and ask him to just give us a few comments, not a formal presentation, but welcome his insights as a former member of the IFE and a professor at CIDE.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you very much to invite me here to give some comments. I have to begin saying that I do agree with the most of that my colleagues said before. I really enjoy their analysis, and I think that their speeches were very complimentary in some sense. I mean, they spoke to us about the pragmatic issues of the PRI, about the losing of the way of the Mexican government, which is, in my opinion, the first point to remark, to say that the government lose the election, and among the struggle with the PRI and the PRD, we are forgetting that the government, the Mexican government, has lost the election, and that we have to see a little far why the Mexican government lost the election. This is, in my opinion, the first point to say. There is a lot of things to say about it. Perhaps the Mexican government lost the election because the inequity, because perhaps the security, this strategy, which is a very cost strategy, as Francisco said before, it cost 70,000 people killed, assassinated in the last 6 years. Perhaps the Mexican government lost the election because the conflict into the PAN, into the governmental party, there was a big conflict into the governmental party before the campaign and during the campaign. Perhaps the government lost the election because the weakness of the candidate Josefina Vázquez Mota. She was not a strong candidate as Peña Nieto. She was a very weak candidate, and not only a weak candidate in terms of her proposals, her programs, but also as, in my opinion, her unmoved loyalty to the President Calderon. He was absolutely loyal with President Calderon, and all the costs upon the government went to her, went to the candidate of the governmental party. But anyway, one of 3 or 4 things, the cost of the social inequity, the cost of the strategic fight, the crime, the organized crime, the cost of the weakness candidate, or the loyalty to the actual politics. There is a combination, a mixture that ran to the government to lose this election, and this is something important to say. A second comment is that the PRI won, of course, the election, as Joy said before. The PRI won the election long before this 2012. I do agree with that analysis. Not only because the strong way to govern in the local field of the Mexican politics, but because the PRD abandoned the political negotiation. I think that it was important that the PRD, after 2006, abandoned the institutions, trying to go with López Obrador to build a new movement, a new social movement, the so-named Morena, which was a kind of an organization to keep López Obrador upon the polls and to give him the personal power to go again to this new election. So the PRD went to a new struggle inside the party. The PRD lived a very tough struggle between the López Obrador movement and the Chuchos. No? The Chuchos is a name of the leaders of the PRD because their names are Jesús Zambrano and Jesús Ortega. So the so-named Chuchos were trying to go with a party, with a real party, into the institutions and into the negotiation with the government of Calderon against the position of López Obrador, fighting against the government of Felipe Calderon. So it was a great division into the PRD, and I think that this is another reason to see the PRD losing this new election. I have to say as well that Enrique Peña Nieto was firmly supported by the television, as Francisco González said before, by the television networking. And yes, I think as well, as Francisco said before, that we need another kind of explanation, Jorge, about the polls firms, because there was a big mistake in the results. And I think that it is not enough to say that the reason is in the design of the ballots. I think there is another kind of reason, technical or political reasons, and that we have to find it out. Because people is thinking, the half of the people in Mexico is thinking right now that the polls firms was working to make Peña Nieto win. And this is part of the problem of legitimacy that we have right now in Mexico. This is something to explain, and we need a new explain about it. I believe that the last question to say, Eric, is if is there any chance after this election to abort the democratic process in Mexico? This is important. If the transition of the consolidation of democracy in Mexico is going to be back to the past as a consequence of the return of the all-authoritarian party to the party. And of course, I have not an answer to this big question, but I have to think that there is a possibility to stop the democratic process or to get into a big or a huge problems of the democratic process, because at least 3 reasons. The problem of legitimacy, I insist that the half of the population in Mexico think that this was an unfair election, think that there was a fraud. It's the half of the population, and it is not easy to go on with this lot of people thinking that there was a fraud. I think there is a big risk with the democratic process because the offensive of the PRD and López Obrador, I have to say this, against the electoral institutions. They don't believe on electoral institutions. They don't believe there is enough rules to go with elections. And we can be sure that we are going to have another reform process in the next year, but we cannot be sure about the costs of this new electoral reform, because it is very linked with the political reform as a whole and with probably the reforms that we need to grow up in terms not only of economic growth, but in terms of social equity. So in the next 3 years, we will see, we can be sure, I think that we can be sure about it, a very huge negotiation trying to get everything in the same pot. And it could be very difficult to deal with. The second is the weakness of the government, of the actual government, to live with the political conflict right if there is a big political conflict, and could be, right in the end of the period. We have not to think only in the first 100 days of the new government, but in the last 100 days of this government. And I think this is a challenge, a big political challenge. And I am afraid that there is the risk of the criminal organizations which could see the transition to a new government as an opportunity to strengthen their actions. There is a problem, a real problem with the criminal organizations. Yes, on the other hand, we have a new and stronger civil society. We have a new and stronger public opinion, that's the truth. We have a notable evolution of the free press and a very more extended conscious, as we have seen, of the people, and especially of the young people in Mexico, with a new agenda, with a new kind of agenda, not the agenda, the old agenda to, which was about the transition to democracy, but a new agenda with problems like human rights, like public education, like social inequity, and the lack of accountability. This is not an electoral agenda per se. This is a new agenda who is concerned with the way that the government has to govern. And of course, we have to go after the elections to get this agenda in the way that it worth, I think it works. This is my comments.
Thank you, Mauricio. I want to do a couple things since we had to reorder things a little bit. I want to give Jorge a chance to respond because there is a public perception that the TV industry was biased in favor of Peña Nieto. There's a perception that the polling was biased in favor of Peña Nieto or one of the other candidates. So I want to give you an opportunity. Then we'll take 2 or 3 questions from the audience very briefly, and then we'll call on Pablo Gutierrez from the OAS to wrap things up. Okay?
Thank you. Well, I think that the criticism against polling in Mexico, I mean, we can divide, as Mauricio said, in between political reasons and technical reasons. Addressing the political ones, I think that, as I showed you, most of the polls, or practically all the polls 2 weeks before the election, were more or less on the same pace. Obviously, we have to look into what happened. Of course, the easy explanation is to say that electoral preferences change. All the polls that were published were conducted 1 week before the election. We know that 1 out of 5 voters 1 week before the election still had doubts about whom they would support on election day. Secondly, as I showed you, the groups where López Obrador did did better were the young people and the college-educated people. These are the more volatile, in political terms, groups in Mexico. Even during the campaign, if you look at the preferences of these groups, they show a lot of change. So probably there was something to it, some volatility. But I want you to think about the political argument. When I hear the argument that say that public opinion, that polls shape voting behavior, I think that's a very condescending view on voters. What it means is that the thing that matters most for voters was who was ahead in the race. It didn't matter the state of the economy, it didn't matter the killings, it didn't matter the level of poverty. As I showed you, there are a lot of reasons behind a person's vote, and the exit poll data show that voters reacted to that. Those who were unsatisfied were more likely to vote for López Obrador and also for Peña. But I think that we have to put into perspective all these very, very large number of reasons behind the decision to vote. And certainly there will be some people that take into account who is ahead in the polls, but I can tell you that the people were not clear about who was in first place. Basically, many people think that the candidate they are going to support is the candidate who is going to win. Indeed, we asked 1 week before, and there were 51% of the Mexican population that say that that Peña Nieto was in first place, but the rest of the electorate say that either López Obrador or Josefina Vázquez Mota were in first place. Secondly, it was very unclear for voters who was in second place. Even those who say that Peña was in first place, they were split between López Obrador or Josefina Vázquez Mota in second place. So I think that it is the impact that can have public opinion on voting behavior or the results of polls on voting behavior is rather limited. This being said, obviously the results of polls affect the strategic behavior of Mexican elites, especially fundraising. One of the criticisms is that many many candidates, or Josefina Vázquez Mota or Peña were not, or López Obrador were not able to raise more money because of the results of polls. That might be true, and that's something, although the funny thing is that it is illegal for a party to get more than 10% of its fundraising outside of public financing. So 10%. So if this happens, I mean, in the first place, they were not allowed to do so, but this really can be the main impact of the results of polls, but especially on the behavior of elites. I don't think that on the way people perceive or decide their vote. Going back to the technical reasons, at least on my side, I have ruled out sampling. The sampling results were more or less, of the pre-electoral poll were more or less in very close correspondence to the actual result. Non-response was neither a factor, and so far the more plausible explanation that I have found is the new ballot. I mean, it's really thinking that in a poll somebody would cross 3 different parties or 2 different parties or several combinations, and especially asking voters with a ballot that reflects, that evokes partisan identities is not as accurate as a question or a simulated ballot that's about candidates. We have to focus more on candidates and less on parties. I think that's the way I see it.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take 3 questions, and then we're going to invite Pablo Gutierrez up from the OS. So we have a question here, we have a question here, and I guess right here, the young man. Would you please identify yourselves and then and keep it short so we can get some answers?
Okay, I'm Dennis Gilbert from Hamilton College. My question is about vote buying. Vote buying has a history in Mexico. As I recall, in 2000, there was outrageous vote buying, but it didn't seem to have much effect.
What's that?
There's a secret ballot in Mexico. I wonder if people don't just take the money or the card or the washing machine or whatever it is and vote for whoever they want to. I mean, does it really make a difference is my question.
Thank you. We had a question over here, right here.
Yeah, Eric Rojo, Sedantec de Monterrey. This question for Joy. Given the comments that Mauricio made to the challenges faced by Mexico and Peña Nieto today and your presentation, do we have the old dinosaur repainted, or do we have a young dinosaur with a new agenda?
Okay, we had a question for a young man right here in the middle.
Good morning. My name is Philip Gardner. I'm from the Foreign Policy Initiative. My question also relates to vote buying, but from a slightly different angle. How is it possibly acceptable that Mr. Peña Nieto can accede to the presidency when such questions do remain on YouTube videos of people saying that the PRI paid them to vote for them?
Right. Maybe get some feedback from Pablo Gutierrez on this in a minute, but let's go with these 3 questions now, and then we'll make the transition. Joy, do you want to start us off?
Sure thing. First of all, I think that this also relates back to Mauricio's points about authoritarianism returning to Mexico. I think something that everyone can be sort of happy about in terms of democracy or the ability of the old PRI to return is the fact that the PRI does not have a majority either in the House or in the Senate, or the Congress or the Senate. Especially the Senate, this is very important because the Senate lasts 6 years and because the Senate sort of acts as a more stodgy, blockage on the crazies in the Chamber of Deputies. However, in terms of what we saw about the old PRI, well, I mean, there are these questions about vote buying, there are questions about the relationship with Televisa, there are all sorts of questions about the ability and the willingness of the PRI to play by the new political institutions that have been growing since the late 90s and very strongly into the 2000s, whether the PRI is going to, circumvent them, weaken them, or learn to play as a somewhat divided party and deal with the new political institutions that are supposed to keep Mexican democracy strong. And I'm thinking especially of the IFE. I'm thinking of the Transparency Institute, the IFAI. I'm thinking of the Supreme Court. I mean, there are many. But I think one thing that speaks well to all of these points is the fact that the PRI does not have a majority in either house, even though it can buy or convince, however you want to, because whatever. Either way, it can make a majority. There's no doubt about it. However, these are temporary majorities that are going to be based on each bill. And this makes a huge difference in terms of the ability of the PRI to steamroll all other sorts of political institutions around it. And I'll leave it there. Let other people talk.
Francisco?
Sure, thank you so much. On the issue of vote buying, is it important? One of the things that was discussed throughout the electoral process was if people were allowed to go into the polling booth with their cell phones, photography, evidence. This was left to states as a state issue, jurisdiction. And several states, in fact, banned people from going to the polling booth with it, but the majority of them didn't. That's a new, very palpable channel through which you could end up, in fact, receiving what you were promised or not, given evidence. Why is this person going to be president if YouTube keeps showing all these people saying, yeah, here's the card, nappies for the baby, subsidized gasoline? Well, the law does not say that that is a crime. A crime is to burn ballots. A crime is to steal ballots. But the process through which the individual elector, goes through mentally, physically, between input and the output, that remains very laxly regulated. So there is widespread evidence that the party at least tried to buy votes. Yeah, you could just, show them your finger and say, okay, I'll take anything and everything you give me, and then I'll do whatever my conscience says. That's what López Obrador was telling the people, saying, yeah, of course, accept all those baskets with basic food, medicine, and then just make up your mind on your own. It's not illegal, believe it or not. Old or new dinosaur, this is more a transitional species. It's not the old T-Rex by any means. I spoke with a few, not many, but with a few PRI elder statesmen who think that Peña and his team are very cohesive. There's distrust of people around them, even within the PRI. Many in the old guard feel left out. And this is someone who's been already working, he hit the ground running. He's been governor for 6 years. So he's got a working team, which is younger and, Estado de Mexico based. The elder statesmen are grumbling, but there's little I think I can do, particularly if he manages to show leadership and comes across as effective. If that's the case, then the elder statesmen will want to strengthen him as well. I'll leave it there.
Mauricio?
I want to say that to buy votes, it is prohibited. It is prohibited as a crime in the Código Penal. Penal code. And that's probably the problem, that in Mexico, as you know, have a very complicated electoral system. It's a baroque electoral system which is built upon the lack of confidence. This is the reason of the baroque design the point is that every new election gives new reasons to add new rules. So you have a very huge building with a very complicated rules, and every 3 or 6 years you add new rules and new mechanisms to avoid the fraud. There are many ways to make fraud. One of them was the changes on the penal code. And it is absolutely prohibited. It's a crime to give money, to give dádivas. I don't know how to say dádivas in English. To give
Emoluments.
emoluments.
Handouts.
It sounds nice in English. Dádivas in Spanish is a little worse.
Handouts.
No? Emoluments. Well,
Handouts.
hands out. That's better. That's better. Handout. Dádivas to buy boats. What's the problem? The problem is that that is not an issue for the IFE, for the institution that goes with the electoral organization. You know, the IFE is responsible for the electoral organization as a whole, but it is not responsible about the penal issues. The penal issues is the responsible institution for that things is the government. FEPADE. We have an attorney for electoral issues, but this attorney is part of the Mexican government. So we have a lot of demands right now in the FEPADE, the attorney to try to manage the buying of the boats, but we have to wait all the judicial process, which is not an electoral process, but a judicial process, because it is a crime. So there is no any consequence between the criminal things and the electoral things. I guess I'm trying to explain this complicated system. The other thing is the moral approach, and I do agree with you. The moral approach is a big thing in this electoral process. It's just one thing more to say, which is I'm afraid to say that all the parties use the public money and use the power they have to go buying boats. How can we manage to know exactly the amount of boats that are bought? How can we manage to know exactly, as Francisco said before, if there is some people who changed the intention of the boat before and after they have money from the parties? How can the electoral institutions manage, in terms of legal terms, to know exactly where is the border between the conscious and the sale of the selling boats? It is a big problem, and we are among this problem. You are right. We have a very big moral problem around the political parties in Mexico.
Okay. Our two panelists want to say something, but I'm going to keep you to very short because we want to give Pablo Gutierrez as well a chance. Go ahead, Joy.
I just want to very quickly defend the PRD, something I almost never do, and say that under the new leadership of Ebrard and Mancera, who are basically already, as we speak, sort of putting distance between themselves and López Obrador, They are the modern left that the PRD has needed for, 20 some odd years now. They're very conscious that their party is seen as sort of old-fashioned and non-economic and sort of non-modern, and they are the ones who, in the next couple of years will be sort of drilling the new message of the new PRD into voters' minds. And so we should definitely wait to see a very strong showing in 2018. And on the electoral reform of 2008, what did you expect was going to happen when you stopped making the parties pay for their media spots? Where are they going to spend all that money? They spend the money buying votes. It's no big surprise. You fix one thing, you fix one problem, and you cause another problem. So.
Francisco, real quick.
Just very quickly, very relieved to know that vote buying is a crime in my country. Unrelieved to know that absolutely nothing happens whatsoever when this takes place. And as Mauricio was saying, this becomes a penal issue, so people can be punished, individuals, but no one knows what happens to the votes they were proselytizing about. The votes will remain there.
Good.
And that's a problem.
Well, vote buying is present. I think that Mauricio said the question is to assess the order of magnitude of vote buying. With more than 50 million voters, I mean, how many votes can be bought? And I would be more concerned about clientelistic practices rather than vote buying because of the extension of social programs in Mexico, oportunidades, even Seguro Popular. We see that governments are extending or practicing clientelistic arrangements, whether the PAN, the PRD, or the PRD in Mexico City. I mean, this is more extended than vote buying, I would assume.
Join me in thanking our panel, and we're going to transition right away. I'm going to introduce Pablo Gutierrez. He's the director of the Department of Electoral Cooperation and Monitoring at the Organization of American States. They led an electoral observation mission to Mexico for these elections. It was led by former Colombian President Cesar Gaviria. Obviously, Pablo was very instrumental in this process, and I have invited him to talk a little bit about their official observation of the election and what they saw and witnessed there. Thank you, Pablo. Appreciate
Thank you,
your
Eric.
time.
May I start saying that when I listened, of course, to presentations, I'm thinking we have a problem in America because the same issues in Mexico is in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Ecuador, in Peru. So buying votes or the social programs or the first ladies or whatsoever. So we have a big issue in Latin America in the electoral system. I want to start saying that I think there's a big difference between the 2006 and the last election in Mexico, that the results are not in question in Mexico. There are problems in the electoral process, but the results are not in question in Mexico. And that is our statement, our last statement in Mexico in our electoral mission. This is the first time that the OAS have the possibility to observe Mexico, because maybe you know we need the request of the countries. We don't have, today, we don't have the possibility to observe countries like the US. I hope so. Let me say this. The electoral system in Mexico is like a cathedral, a Baroque cathedral. But they have a very important rules about campaign financing and rules about the crimes in the penal code or something like that. We don't have, for example, in the whole Caribbean, any law about campaigns, financing campaigns. If I remember well, I think there's a resolution of the Supreme Court here in the US that is some crazy things about they know limits in the financing campaign. So, like I said, we have the same problems in the America. Let me start saying that some background about this, the last election. Mexico have a long story of suspicious elections. I think we all know that. Until the year 2000, the PRI governed Mexico and systematically won power through elections with certain irregularities. But the democratic process was hit by two key issues, I think. One is a series of electoral reform. The last is 2007. That reform started in the 96 when a reform created the IFE, the Federal Electoral Institute. The second issue is about the 2006 crisis. Of course, this difference between Felipe Calderón and Andrés Manuel López Obrador was less than 1%, 0.4%. And if we look the causes and the effects of this 2006 crisis, of course, we have these tight results. We have a very practical problem because there's an agreement between the political parties, and they stop the transmission of the results. Although this, of course, this agreement after the stop of the transmission, the PRD said, no, we don't sign any agreement, but it's real. And of course, the impartial and the operating capacity of the IFE was severely questioned after this election. The third element in this background is the 2007 reform. In September, the three major parties in the Congress approved this big reform. I think it's the biggest reform in the last 10 years in the America. Argentina made a reform like a year and a half, and it's very similar to the Mexican reform of the 2007. Sorry. This reform introduced many changes, like, for example, the election of the new president of the IFE. Of course, the escalated re-election of the Electoral Federal Institute is another issue. The political parties will not able to buy by themselves time in television, and there's several controls about the media, the newspapers, radio, etc. And of course, the private financing was decreased in 85% to stay at 40 million pesos. I think it's very important to talk about some special features of this election. Like I said, this 2007 reform is a very important reform, and the main issue that is in the center of this reform is to create conditions for electoral equity. For example, they have norms about gender. The 2007 reform increased the quota for position in the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies to 30% to 40%. Transparency. The parties were requested to present reports regarding their financing, as well as information on the process to elect their leaders and propose candidates. In issues like political and campaign financing, the amount of the money for public financing of party was reduced. Parties could only use time in TV and radio as assigned by IFE, following 30 to 70% formula. And the vote recount is very important because the definite computation of result and final proclamation of result. This is one of the most important reforms after the 2006 crisis. Was the possibility of conducting a final count of the vote at the district level. In certain cases, like there's obvious mistakes or null votes, there are greater than difference between the first and the second voted candidates, etc., etc. And first of all, the financing control. They create a special unit for the fiscalization of political finances that depends on IFE. The second issue in this election is the student movement. I think we already talked about the Yo Soy 132, I'm at 132, that create in Ibero-American University. And I think the movement was based around three main points. One is the democratization of the media. Two, a call for an informed vote by all Mexicans. And three, the right to be informed about, to be informed without any manipulations. Of course, if we look for achievement of this movement, I think it's very important to say that, for example, they get Televisa and TV Azteca to broadcast the second debate on their main channel, so I think it's very important. And second, the movement also succeed in organizing a third debate amongst the presidential candidates. Just a final consideration. First, like I said, this is an election in Latin America. We have the same problems. Let me say it, there's no strongest institution, electoral institution, than IFE in Latin America, believe me. We observe, I have the possibility to observe 50 elections the last 5 years, and that's for real. Second, yesterday we end the first phase of the election. Now we have a phase between today and September. For all the, all the problems in the election, I think we had a press conference yesterday of AMLO and the PAN saying that we want to go to the TRIFE and put the proofs and all the problems of the election that they have, of course, if they have proofs, because I think YouTube is not enough in many cases. So, and in the work of the OAS, we observed the post-electoral period. The OAS remained in the country to observe the recount in some districts in the state of Hidalgo, Veracruz, and Mexico. And let me say this, in a general observation, of course, in the most of the vote recount was complete on time and following procedures. So there's no procedures, no problem procedures in the recount in the district. Second, in the 3 federal states that we observed, the preliminary results obtained on the election day were in accordance with the recount on the district level on the 3 types of election. And third, and the political parties, the bad guys sometimes, follow the legal procedures. They follow the legal procedures. So any concerns that they have, no, they follow the legal procedures. In many cases, they said the 3 main parties that everything is correct. Of course, I don't know if any have any study or something, but I think it's very interesting to see, for example, the PRD, the PRD claims about the election and the places that they won or that they lost. Because it's very important, this, I think is because we talk about the moral issues, so I think this is very moral, I think. And it's very important to say that if we took the prep and the recount and the quit count, it's very similar. They have a point, maybe 2 points of difference in the main candidacy. And just two final issues. One, I think it's very important to modernizing the concept of electoral fraud. Electoral fraud per se, like in Mexico and the most countries, understood as an institutional operation, with the goal, of course, of modifying the will of the electoral via, manipulate the electoral system. Today we have this like one of the panelists said, electoral crimes committed by people, group of people. Of course, outside the electoral institution. I think this is very important because we always have this bad news about the election, but this is a good news. As an example, for example, about buying, the electoral institution must, like I think someone said, for a preventive standpoint, reinforce the right to have a secret vote, and that's the main role of the IFE in the election. And just last thing, the base of the system, the electoral system, rests on thousands of citizens that volunteer on election day to administer the election in the voting tables. So the citizens are they who really conduct the election. So the only role of IFE is to choose them, and in the last election they choose them by random, and progressively trains to do the best work in the election. I think this is very important, because it's like to the system is like to split if we have the possibility to split in two half. We have the institution, the IFE and the magistrados, and the citizens. In the citizens, all around the Mexico, and all around Mexico. So when we talk about, like I said, all this issue about buying votes or something, the first responsibility, or the first responsible, are the citizens of Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. We have about 10 minutes for questions here before we end. I just was going to go over real quickly the whole confusing voting process, just for those of you who aren't completely steeped in this, because it is confusing. The night of the election, there is what's called a quick count, or the PREP, where the polling booths are reporting in their totals. That's not an official result. That's a preliminary result that you get that first night. Then the following Wednesday, the IFE oversees the counting of all the totals at the district and local levels, and that confirms or changes those preliminary results. And then there are some challenges, and the parties have presented challenges, and the IFE agreed to recount 60% of the polling places, more or less, if I'm not mistaken. So they have recounted and verified. So now they have certified those results as of yesterday as the final results, and now the parties can challenge legally before the electoral tribunal whether they think there was fraud in any particular polling place or any particular district. So now we're in the third or fourth, depending which way you count it, stage where there are legal challenges. And somebody's asked me what is different about the PRD's response this time and in 2006. And so far as I know, and you might want to correct me, they haven't called on civil disobedience or anything of that. They're still proceeding through the legal challenges that's available to them in the federal electoral law. So that's where we are, in a very confusing process for vote counting. And then the third issue is fraud on voting day and at the ballot booth. But the bigger question that's always in the back of minds of people in Mexico is, are governments and our parties trying to manipulate the process that leads up to the election before people actually cast the ballots, either by using government resources inappropriately or by outright trying to purchase votes by promising money or different kinds of handouts. So that's kind of the complexity of this situation in terms of the election. So we have a few minutes, and I'll take two more questions. We have one right here, and this young lady over here who had her hand up before. So go ahead, please.
Thank you. Ruben Barrera with the Mexican news agency Notimex. And I will use part of the Mauricio analogy. And this is, what are the chances that we may add a new chapel to the Baroque cathedral in the form of a change, I don't know, either in the electoral law or in the Constitution, that allow for a second round of vote, especially considered that in the last presidential election, the margin between the first and second place was minimal. And in this case, Peña Nieto is going to have a very low mandate, given the fact that he has not reached even the 40% of the votes.
Yeah, it's a good question here. I don't know if people could hear about whether new reforms might contemplate a second round of voting, since you have three primary candidates. Peña Nieto won with 38%, a healthy margin of 6 points more or less, but still far from a majority of Mexicans supporting the new president. So that good question. And this young lady here.
Hello, CJ Hernandez from the U.S. State Department. Now that we're getting through the elation of the election and what's to come with Peña Nieto administration, Mauricio quite rightly pointed out that Calderon still has the office for the next 4.5 months. Do any of you see any further action from the current administration in the next session? If so, what could he accomplish or finish up on his way out the door, including do you see criminal code going through or the military justice system reform, federal judicial reform, any of those that he's worked on or that's lying on the bottom of the Senate floor? Do you see them being revived and passed, or what will he do?
I'm going to add to that question because my good friend Joe Duckert didn't get to ask his question, and I'm anticipating what it was. On that front, do we think there'll be progress on the energy reform as well? That was a big part of the proposal from the Peña Nieto camp. So in addition to criminal justice reform, national security reform, is there a chance of action in that area as well? Francisco, you want to take a shot at this?
Second round would be a good idea, but the problem in Mexico is that you've got 3 blocks. They're not of relative size. They're different. You could say, you know, PRI is around 40, PAN 30, PRD 20 something. The key issue there is one of the 3 is going to lose the chair, the analogy of musical chairs. And so no leadership would like to adopt that second round because it's going to leave one of them out. The odds are it would leave usually the candidate of the left out, and probably you would end up having PRI, PAN, given more commonalities regarding, you know, the basic policy basket, facing a left. Currently, the system is you know, the dice are loaded against the leadership of the parties deciding to go for the second round. What does Calderon want to do? I think he wants the clock to tick as fast as it can. He wants to be able to leave. I give him credit for some of the legal justice reforms that you have talked about. One of the great disgraces of Mexico is the absolute absence of a rule of law. Justice being dispensed behind closed doors. Big effort since 2008. I commend it. I wish they were able to work on it to really revamp the criminal justice systems of the country. Can they do it in an extraordinary session? I think it's not the top of the agenda. The top of the agenda, if anything, PRI would like to reach out to the PAN to try to work on labor and fiscal issues, because if energy is going to come to the forefront, the new federal government, first and foremost, has to find new channels of revenue. And so regarding sequencing, you need lower labor costs and lower the costs that the government incurs on the labor and social security side at the same time that you find new sources of revenue. That's the only way that opening Pemex, or at least allowing Pemex to reinvest more of its profits in the future than it does today, because it just gives all its profits to the government, will take place.
I should have pointed out that there's this quirk in the calendar in Mexico, which is that the new Congress that was just elected will take office in early September, 3 months before the new president takes office. So there's sort of a 3-month period there where you have a new Congress, old president, and sometimes it's viewed as an opportunity to deal with unusually difficult political issues because you have a lame duck president and a new Congress. So that's really what's behind some of these questions. Will there be process? Joy, do you want to add anything here before we wrap this up?
About the second round, if it was difficult before the PRI just won the presidency, it's basically impossible now. The PRI would never allow it now, because it's basically dead. I think it's even deader than re-election. And consecutive re-election, I think, is probably far more important in the long run for the health of Mexican democracy than a second round. And that is that's on life support, and I think it's dying. I mean, the PRI will never allow, and the PRD doesn't like consecutive reelection either. I absolutely agree with Francisco. I think what's on the table, the PAN wants some victories. The Vasquez Mota has clearly stated she wants something to go through in this odd period of time between September and December when the new president takes office. I think it's not going to be criminal as much as it's what I've heard is fiscal and tax reform that also goes into the federal labor situation, which is so badly written in Mexico. However, I really would not be very optimistic about that because you have the PAN in the Senate doesn't like the reform that the PRI is cooking up regarding universal Social Security. So that remains to be seen.
Just a very brief final word from the two of you.
Just I used to say a telegraph comment. Now we have to say a Twitter. Twitter. No, I do agree with Joy. I think that there is no possibility to have a second round, political terms. I do agree with that. And if there is any kind of reform, I think that the bad news now is going to the polls firms. I'm afraid about it, Jorge, because I believe that the parties are very concerned about the problem with the polls, and that they are going to try to make new rules to regulate it. If I would
The other rules to regulate
if I
everything
would
else.
have to bet, my bet is on that side.
Well, every time you try to fix something, you make it worse. So let's be careful. Fair about that. Jorge, I know you have to get a word in here.
You have
So
been very
then we're done.
Well, I think that polls in Mexico are highly regulated. I don't think that at the end, I think that the regulation would probably pass through the media, because if what it's been said or discussed in the media, it is that they will try to forbid the media to publish electoral polls. So I think that if that's true, that the regulation will basically affect the media rather than the polling firms, because obviously the main clients of the public opinion firms are the political parties. So, and they will still use it, they will still have two firms working for them. So probably this will affect more the media rather than the media and the information available to voters. So, but the polling firms are highly regulated, and indeed, I favor strict regulation, because then you can focus more on methodological issues, and then you can discriminate against firms that have lower quality standards. So, but it is a very highly regulated industry, and if anything changes, probably will happen or will go through the media and polls.
Okay, I want to thank everyone for their patience and their attention, and thank our guests online and on C-SPAN for being with us this morning. Thank you all.